We're really fortunate today to have Dr. Ellen Kirschman with us. She's been a public safety professional psychologist for 30 years. She's written 2 classic books in the field, I Love a Firefighter and I Love a Cop, both targeted at the families of these professionals, but they're also great primers for people considering getting into the field. And Ellen, you've done so much else and you've worked with so many agencies, I can't even remember it all. Why don't you just tell us a little bit more about your background?
Okay. Well, the first thing that I like people to know is that I am not married to a cop or to a firefighter. I wouldn't consider doing either. That's been my profession. I'm married to a remodeling contractor, and nobody wants to read books about a remodeling contractor. I wrote those books because I could see professionally that families didn't have enough information, that they were married into this job and it was going to affect their entire lifestyle. And there's a lot of ways in which cops and firefighters don't talk to their families about what goes on at work. So I wrote these books in order to better inform the families, because forewarned is forearmed. I should say I know that personally because my brother was a volunteer firefighter for a number of years, and he never talked about the job either. I've also done a lot of work. I've been training peer support teams in both fire departments and police departments and for the Drug Enforcement Administration. And currently I spend almost all of my time going around the country and around the world, actually, giving workshops to cops and firefighters about how to take care of themselves psychologically so that they have a long shelf life in these professions. And then I do workshops for couples, firefighters and their families, and police officers and their families, so that we can help them strengthen the resilience they already have in their family so that the job doesn't damage their family lives. And then I also work with clinicians who are working with these first responder populations as well. And the last thing I think I want to mention is my volunteer work. I spend about a month or more a year volunteering at a place called the West Coast Post-Trauma Retreat, which is a retreat for emergency workers, cops, firefighters, dispatchers, sometimes some military people who are suffering with post-traumatic stress disorder. And also we have a section, a retreat for spouses of people who are in the emergency services. It's a place for them to come and to heal from their post-traumatic stress disorder.
How is the death of a police officer or a firefighter different for the family than the death of someone who's not a police officer or a firefighter is to their family?
Well, I think there are a lot of things that are different when a firefighter or a police officer dies in the line of duty as compared to the general population. And one of them, of course, is the enormous pageantry of the funeral and the great media attention, and the fact that there'll be fire trucks on every overpass and hundreds, if not thousands, of people showing up at the funeral. It becomes a public event, which is sometimes very helpful and supportive to the family, and sometimes is absolutely overwhelmed. And I think that many people who've lost somebody in the line of duty remember those days in a daze. That's very hard to take it all in. It's so overwhelming in scale. And that's something that the general public, that you and I don't have to deal with. I'm not sure that there's any way to prepare for this, but I certainly would hope that departments would include and offer the family the opportunity to be part of that kind of planning, which is a very difficult thing to do when you are in the middle of acutely grieving for someone that you've just lost, and you may still be numb and you still may be in shock. But the family's wishes should be number one in terms of the considerations. And I think that, I don't know how people can prepare for that, except that they know perhaps that it's coming and that there are so many people grieving this loss. And it's also a statement to the public as well, that they have to share their very private grief in such a public way. Because sharing this private loss in such a public way is is very challenging. And in my experience, having dealt with this many more times than I wanted to, I think it is different for every single family. And almost everything I'm going to say to you today, one has to take into consideration that all people are different. Some people really feel totally supportive. I had someone tell me that the emails, the hundreds of emails that she received over the phone, was like a soft rain falling on her. It felt very, very comforting. And other people feel as though that after the publicity's gone, after the intense interest and support at the beginning, they feel as though they have just been abandoned if there is nothing, no follow-up and no continuation. Now, we also have to remember that most people have their own natural support system, their own real families, not work families, and are not as dependent upon the work family for support. So in each case, it would depend on the kind of natural support that grieving family has as to how they'll react to the loss of all the publicity when it turns someplace else, as it always will. On the one hand, the loss of a loved one is a human experience. We will all have it in our lives, unfortunately. We will all lose somebody that we love, and ultimately we will grow old and lose our own lives. So I find that in working with the emergency response professions, there is something we call the fallacy of uniqueness. We are different from other people. But at the same time, there's a kind of a dilemma because we're also the same as everyone else. So all I know to say is that both things are true, that the pain and the ache and the loss and the difficulty in losing somebody that you love will be the same for all human beings, will be a shared kind of experience. And yet there are certain things about being in the emergency response profession that are unique. And one of those, of course, is the massive publicity, the pageantry around the funerals. If there is, if an officer is murdered and there is a trial that takes a long time afterwards, that's different, that kind of ongoing and continuity of that. Same thing if there is a terrible, tragic accident like we saw when that furniture store collapsed on the firefighters, or September 11th, since we've just only recently passed the anniversary of that date. That is very different from somebody who dies not in the midst of an enormous incident in which there may be blame and fault and constant investigation and trying to figure out what happened. That makes things, anything that brings media attention, of course, makes it more challenging and difficult.
From a practical point of view, what can families do to prepare for the loss of their firefighter or police officer or EMT spouse?
One of the things that I have found is that because most emergency responders are relatively young people, they don't want to consider the fact that they might get hurt or killed in the line of duty. And it's kind of difficult to consider that and actually start to prepare for it. But there are definitely things that would make the unlikely possibility, and I'd like to stress unlikely possibility, that a person would be killed in the line of duty, will make it easier if it happened, if certain things have already been handled, such as having a will, such as having a personal information form about what your requests would be should you be killed in the line of duty. For example, if there's somebody that you would prefer to make the notification to your family and you don't want it to automatically revert to your supervisor, but you want it to be your best friend, then you have to have that written down. If you prefer to be cremated and not buried, you have to have that written down. If you need to make sure everybody in your family knows where all of the important papers are, where the money is, what the bank account numbers are, all of those kinds of detailed information is very important. Where your kids go to school. Who should pick your kids up from school? Who should notify your kids? I have a story in my firefighter book about a firefighter who had done this kind of work, and so when he was killed in the line of duty, his department knew that his parents didn't speak English. They spoke only Spanish. So they could send a Spanish-speaking firefighter to the home, or with the chief, I think. No, the chief didn't make the notification, but they sent somebody Spanish-speaking to the home, and they also brought along a paramedic because they knew that this firefighter's father had a serious heart condition. Those are the kind of things that can really make a very, very difficult time a little easier.
When a public safety professional dies, oftentimes they're eligible for certain kinds of benefits that normal people wouldn't be. And there are some resources available to help them with that, aren't there?
Ralph, firefighters and police officers are normal people. What is different is that if you're selling insurance or you are working in a grocery, you won't have the kind of national support or benefits that will accrue to the first responders. When a police officer is killed in the line of duty, an organization called Concerns of Police Survivors, or COPS for short, will be notified, and they are a group of survivors that will come in and provide all kinds of emotional support, legal advice about benefits, as well as some absolutely wonderful retreats for grieving parents, grieving spouses, grieving children, siblings, co-workers. They're a terrific organization. When a firefighter or paramedic is killed in the line of duty, the organization called the National Fallen Firefighters Foundation will also provide those same kind of support services and information, both about the emotional aspects of grieving and some of the practical things about money and entitlements.
When a child loses a public safety professional parent, how is it different for them compared to other children losing, a parent not in those professions?
It's very important when you are an emergency responder to have some direct conversation with your children, because they get some terribly inaccurate information off the television and from other kids in the schoolyard who will be saying, oh, your mom's a cop? Well, she's going to get killed because all cops get killed. So I think it's important to keep your kids informed, as much detail as they can handle at the age that they're at. And I would emphasize the fact that officers and firefighters and medics get trained very well. They do safety training. If you can bring them down and show them the kind of training that they have available so that they're not frightened. Little children want to know that if something happened to mom or dad on the job, they want to know that they're going to go to Aunt Susie's house. They can bring their pajamas and their teddy bear. They need that kind of information about their own comfort and their own safety. Older children, of course, can take a more adult discussion of the relative risks, which again I would emphasize are probably less than most people think that they are. So that the kids need to have an accurate point of view. They also need to know how to deal with those kinds of tales that happen in the schoolyard too. Maybe you could rehearse something with them about what to say when a kid says, oh, your dad's going to get killed.
What about the parents? Should public safety professionals be doing anything to prepare their parents for a potential line of duty death?
So if I were commissar of public safety, I would require that every department in the United States hold a family orientation for the families of emergency responders. That would include spouses, parents, siblings, friends, and probably teenage children, maybe not little children, although you could do that too. So that, because when you don't have accurate information about training, about risk, about injury, about potential line of duty death, it's our human tendency to kind of imagine and fill in with our own worst case scenarios. I find when I do family orientations, as I have done quite frequently, that the parents of emergency responders are almost more worried than spouses. And, you know, that's a natural thing that parents feel they need to protect their children, even when their children are grown-ups. I've been on a panel with many people who are married to police officers whose children then become police officers, and they will say out front, I never worried about my wife or my husband the way I worry about my son or my daughter. So it's a different, parents carry that kind of responsibility, and I think all members of the family are helped by having information, by coming in, sitting in a patrol car, going on a ride along, watching fireground training, watching a live burn, whatever they can learn that's accurate and substantial is going to help them with wild imaginations and worst case scenarios that may keep them up at night.
Ellen, tell us a little bit about the grieving process in general after a loved one dies.
Well, again, with the caveat that every family is unique and everyone will be different, I think it depends upon the circumstances of the line of duty death. Whether somebody was actually murdered on the job or died in an accident, those circumstances will influence how the grieving process goes, as well as what kind of preparation the department has and what kind of ongoing support they have for the surviving family. But in general, grieving is just like being on a roller coaster. Alternating phases of feeling angry at God, angry at the department, angry at the person who died for abandoning you, angry at yourself for not having said goodbye to that person that morning, or I had a child tell me once that they always prayed for Daddy in the morning and they forgot to ask their guardian angel, and then then they felt terribly guilty. Phases of thinking that the person you lost, I had a mother tell me that she thought she saw her son on the street many times and was telling herself that he wasn't really dead, even though she had seen his body, but that he was actually undercover. And one of these days he was just going to walk in the door and tell her that the case was over and he was back again. So there can be a feeling for some people of being absolutely crazy, of having some supernatural occurrences happen. A firefighter's wife recently told me after he died of a work-related illness that she found a bird in her yard, which she thought was a message from her husband. So and she's not the kind of person who is that spiritual. So you have to buckle your seatbelt because it's an enormous roller coaster of depression, guilt, anger, all those things that I just mentioned. It's very important to have support and help, but not all help that's offered is the kind of help that a person needs. So there can be departments, I think that emergency responders can be a big family and they can be very helpful. Sometimes they can be too helpful. They don't give you enough privacy. They don't give you enough space. All they want to do is talk about the person who died and not about the survivor's concerns. Or they're going to come and take your children to their little league game every single week, and they've overpromised something out of their own concern initially, and they can't follow through, and then you feel angry and upset. Or they do follow through all the time. So, I mean, I've seen a variety of things happen to families. It's just important to know that there is this roller coaster and your feelings will change almost moment to moment, and the best you can do is try to get through the day, one thing at a time, one day at a time.
If I'm a colleague or a supervisor of someone that's been killed in the line of duty, what can I do, or what have you seen done to make it worse for the family, either out of ignorance or perhaps even good intentions?
That's a great question. Emergency responders are action-oriented people and problem solvers. So they want to get in there and do something. And though I think what can be damaging to a family is to not consult with the family about what they want done, but to just get in there and start, this is probably a silly example, repapering the bathroom, painting the house, mowing the lawn, doing something with the surviving children without having checked with the surviving parent to see if that's what they want done. Making funeral arrangements without consulting the family. Now, certainly there are times when families are so distraught they cannot make any decisions. At that time, then you have to ask, is it all right if I make this decision for you? Let me do that and then check back with you again. But I think the most damaging thing you can do out of the best intentions is to take over. Another way that I have seen departments inadvertently cause problems for families is when the question comes up about viewing a body. A person may have, as they've died in the line of duty, their bodies may be burned, mutilated in some way. That's pretty awful. And so the department will say, look, we don't think you should see the body, or there's been a plane crash and the body's really destroyed. That's done out of the best of intentions, but what we do know is that some families really want to see the body. They want to sit with the body in whatever shape it's in. They want a private moment to say goodbye, and if they're not permitted to do that, it's an ache that never goes away. It feels so unfinished. And sometimes viewing the body really helps bring home the reality that this person is in fact truly dead and gone. So I think the decision has to rest with the family. Now, there are a couple of things one can do to sort of ease that, or rather prepare the family. You can, of course, explain the state in which the body is in. You can cover parts of the body that are mutilated, or I've heard some people even will take a photograph of the body and show it to the family first, asking them if they want to make that decision, because it's miniaturized then in a photo. But I truly believe, as awful as the body may be, it is really important that that decision be left with the family. I mean, think of how powerless a family feels having lost somebody in the line of duty. To further take away the control they have over their lives, and they feel they've been totally out of control, is really not the right thing to do.
Oftentimes, a public safety professional's death is captured either on news film or dash cam or something. And that's going to be all over the TV and the internet for days, if not years. What advice would you give to the family about dealing with that, and especially if there are children involved?
I remember walking into the home of an officer who had been shot a few days before Christmas, and there was the Christmas tree and all the presents under the Christmas tree and all the family who had arrived to celebrate the holiday together. And the children were watching the news about their father's death, at which point the defense attorney for the suspect who shot this officer was claiming police brutality and setting up his, obviously, his defense for the person who shot and killed this officer. And it was very important for us to talk with the family about monitoring this child's television watching, and also for his father's colleagues to come in there and talk to him about what was going on, how this was a strategy and a ploy, and what his father really did, because this was definitely not a case of police brutality. So when something gets that much publicity, the children's television viewing, what they hear at school, needs to be monitored and discussed with some adults who are responsible and connected to this child. There was another child whose father had killed several people. His father was a police officer and had killed someone who had shot 2 other officers. And this was a teenage boy, and he said he went to school and his teachers were actually saying that his father should be sent to jail for killing the man who killed his 2 coworkers. This was a terrible thing, and no one expected that their teacher would be saying such things. So again, the parents had to intervene for the child and help the child prepare for and know what to do, or else find a safe haven in school, maybe the nurse's office or the principal's office, where they can get away from kids who can be, as you know, terribly cruel at times. Monday morning quarterbacking seems to be a favorite activity of human beings. So even in the case where firefighters may have been killed, and people in the media or just gossip around town or on the those webcam viewings that are repeated endlessly on the internet, blaming the victims for their own deaths or blaming the firefighters for their own deaths. Again, information is very powerful and can also be very consoling, especially to explain to children who may not be old enough to understand. Now, you would never want to lie or distort the information for a child. Again, it has to be, your conversation has to be age appropriate, but you have to be direct and talk to the kids. And you also have to make sure that your kids feel free enough to come home and tell you what's going on, who might be teasing them at school, who said what about their mom or their dad, so that you have the opportunity to give them accurate information.
Oftentimes, the aftermath of a public safety professional's death just goes on and on. For instance, if a fire was an arson, that investigation was going to go on for years. Many officer-involved shootings, the trial goes on for years. Are the surviving families, the adult members of those surviving families, pretty good self-monitors of how much of that stuff to take in over the coming years? Or is there some advice that you would give them in that light?
Well, that varies from family to family. Some families become obsessed with watching the television and reading the news, and that's not helpful. In the struggle to regain parts of your life back again and to stay functioning, you have to attend to all parts of your life. And if this begins to take over everything, that's probably too much. I would advise families who have just lost somebody in the line of duty, it's really helpful to have a neutral third party to talk to so that they can kind of help you monitor how much of your life that you're spending. I think that, and that would be like a therapist, a chaplain, a good friend, but somebody who's not quite as close to the situation as you are. In my experience, if there is some trial that happens, the families really want to be there. They feel it's something that they owe the person who has died in the line of duty to see this through to the end. And as you said, these trials can drag on and on and on, particularly if they're capital cases. So it helps if there are friends who will go with you, if or again, a chaplain or someone from the department, because sometimes it's very difficult. There'll be photographs and videos up close and things to view around the death that may be very hard for you to take. So I would urge departments to help prepare families for what they might expect if there is a long trial or a lot of media publicity following a line of duty death.
Oftentimes, a public safety professional's death will be captured either on news footage or dash cams or something like that. And these line of duty death films actually, in many cases, make very good training films to help members of the profession in the future avoid those kind of deaths. How involved should the department be in getting the family's permission to use those training films?
For years of working with the DEA, training their trauma team, we used Joseph Wambaugh's film, The Onion Field, which is based on a real story. And this as an example of what not to do. They paraded the surviving officer around to various briefings where he was required to stand up and tell the other officers just exactly what he did wrong and how that resulted in the death of his partner. Eventually that actually drove him crazy, along with a very protracted trial. So I think when using all these technologies, the things that are captured on the webcams, on dash cams, on telephones, it's very important to prepare the family for this, to consult with the family about it, and to never use those to humiliate or criticize the people involved, but rather to understand and to learn from the incident. And that also pertains to coworkers who may have been there at the line of duty death and feel terribly guilty for something they did or didn't do. So it really has to be done with great respect for the feelings of the family and the coworkers, because these films will be seen by people who don't know the folks involved and who weren't there, and the potential for misuse is great, and therefore the department really has to stay on top of that.
What about families listening to the last radio transmissions of a dying firefighter, police officer, if they're available? Is that a good idea, or is that a bad idea?
I'm going to repeat myself. The important thing is that the family makes that decision for themselves. Some families, I think particularly after September 11th, there were the last transmissions were readily available. And some families took them but put them away and said, it's too painful to listen to them right now. I'm going to listen to them when I feel able to do so. So the important point to make is that it has to be the family's decision, no one else's.
Ellen, what about anniversary dates of the death and other triggers? How should the family be prepared for those?
Well, those are really also challenging and very important. And I think it's one of the ways, perhaps, that public safety families are different from people who are not in public safety. Generally speaking, most departments will want to do something on the anniversary of the death, something formal. Again, the family should always be invited to come and perhaps even consulted about what to do on those anniversaries. In particular, I think the first anniversary is most difficult for people, although for some it stays difficult for several years. In terms of triggers, by triggers I mean things that remind you of what happened. There'll be lots of triggers. They will be holidays, there'll be birthdays, there'll be the sound of a siren, there'll be the presence of someone from the department, there'll be another shooting or another wildland fire or another helicopter crash. And because public safety people are so identified with the profession, and their families are identified, and they're identified with each other, all of these can serve to stir up feelings and emotions. If your family lives in the same town where the line of duty death happens, every time you drive by that spot is another trigger. I think that families need to be prepared for this, and that's where some counseling, some grief counseling really helps, because the idea of how to deal with triggers and how to expect them and how to control your responses, or at least minimize them to the degree to which it's possible, will come from a little bit of professional guidance. But they happen a great deal for people in public safety.
How long does the grieving process take? I mean, how long are families going to be in a great deal of pain for after their loved one dies?
There's an old story about a photographer who took a picture of Abraham Lincoln, was asked, how long are Abraham Lincoln's legs? And the photographer answered, they're long enough to reach the ground. And I think that's a good model for grieving. Every family is different. there are really no timetables for that, and this is important for families to understand, because the people surrounding you may want you to get better in a hurry because your pain is unbearable to them. So it's really important for you to cry when you have to, grieve when you have to, not to put up a brave front, not to try to cover up how you're feeling. General ballpark, and this is, take it with a grain of salt, a loss of a spouse anywhere from 1 to 3 years before you feel like you have recovered from this. Loss of a child, maybe never. You live with that hole in your heart forever. But you learn to live with it so that the grief is not taken over every aspect of your life. You're able to work, you're able to relate to other people, you're able to be social and maybe have some fun, but you never lose that hole in your heart from the loss of a child. And so these are very long and protracted, this kind of grief, especially when it's unexpected and blindsided. If someone is ill and has a long illness, you are somewhat prepared for their loss. But these sudden deaths are very tragic and very hard to adjust to in a hurry, for sure. I think that families, grieving families, should try to aim for what we call a new normal. Nothing will be the same again. It's impossible to try to make your life the way it was before, make everything all right for your children, have the birthday parties, be very happy. You have to begin to develop a new lifestyle, almost a new normal, ways in which you can function and progress with the grief, which becomes a kind of companion who at times is front and center stage and at other times is in the background. Particularly for people who are young when they have lost somebody, when they've lost a spouse, because we expect to have that happen to us when we're older, but when you have lost a spouse who may be in their 20s, 30s, or 40s, things are different. I would advise the young people to find some kind of a support group for young people, because you don't want to be the 26-year-old widow who's sitting in a room full of 75 and 85-year-old other women. And the question of when do you move on and how do you move on and what is it like to, as you recover from grief, that you feel like you've lost the memory of that person, or you can't remember what they felt like anymore, what they looked like, what they smelled like. That in itself is a secondary loss. I believe for many people that will come back again. But there is that kind of temporary panic that people experience. Like, if I'm not grieving intensely, this is the way I stay close to the person that I have lost. I don't want to stop this grieving because I will lose them again. That's part of that roller coaster. I think that feeling will come and go for most people in waves. I think it's also important to mention, particularly for young people, that not to rush into another romance because you are so overwhelmed with loneliness or responsibility for raising children by yourself. I think that's important to take that in a very slow and cautious way. That there will be life, there will be other relationships involved in the future, but to do so with some concern and not out of a great need to fill this empty space in your life. And I think it's also important, if I could mention this too, to caution parents who have lost a first responder in the line of duty to realize that their grief is different and separate from the grief of the spouse. I've heard too many very unfortunate stories about parents saying, well, we've lost our son or daughter. We can never get another son or daughter, but you, spouse, can marry again. That's a very painful and damaging thing for a family to say to one another, and that again may be where some counseling will be helpful to let everybody know that they're experiencing their loss in a different and unique way.
What should a surviving spouse know about the children, what to expect from the children, and how to help them through this period?
Well, this is a very important question, because you were being a parent. There were two parents helping raise children, and now it's all, or the bulk of it is falling on one person. So I've got a couple of notes here about things that one should think about. For one thing, you might expect that your children are going, depending upon what age they were at the time they lost their parent, very often you see children kind of regressing. They become clingy, or they won't go to sleep, they won't go to bed, they won't do their schoolwork. They'll revert back to the stress of the loss, will make them revert back to acting as though they were younger. Or for teenagers, they may withdraw and stop talking to you or start acting out. You want to be prepared for that, and it shouldn't go on for a very long time, or in the case of teenagers, become really destructive. Talk to your children in a straightforward way about what happened. I think I said earlier, don't bend the truth, but give it to them in language that they can understand depending upon the age that they are. If you distort the truth in any way, that's a terrible burden to put on yourself, and eventually they will find out, even if the parent they lost had done something wrong. We all can make mistakes with different kinds of consequences, but you need to find a way to be clear about that, because they'll start hearing it from other people or reading it in the media, as we've been talking about. Don't overprotect your children from sorrow, from your grief. It's important that they feel included in the grieving process and not excluded. And if you overprotect them or put on a happy face or try to make everything normal the way it was, they're either going to feel like you're not being truthful, or they're going to feel like they're being marginalized and excluded from the family. On the other hand, you don't want to overburden them. And this, every family will be different here, but you know, to say to a small boy, you're now the man of the house, is really overburdening children. So you want to be careful about that. Children tend to watch the surviving parent for cues about how to behave and how to feel. And if they see you always masking your sorrow, then they'll do the same thing. If you are drinking heavily and weeping and all the time, then they may become frightened about that. So again, that may sound contradictory to say don't mask your sorrow, but there's a certain point that if you are so overwhelmed that you're losing your ability to parent your children, you really should go get some professional guidance about this. Little kids, and teenagers too, will have trouble talking about this. Kids just don't express themselves in the same way that adults do. So writing a story about what happened to mom or dad, writing in a journal, this is good for the surviving spouse as well as the children, but using hand puppets, making drawings, whatever you can do, other options for ways to talk about their loss besides straight talking, because as I said, that's something that kids don't do about it. And when they get very quiet, I think it's important to ask them if they're thinking about mom or dad, or what they're thinking about. This is not an easy thing to do. There are plenty of books and plenty of guidance out there on helping children cope with death. And I think that accept help as the parent and the surviving spouse. Accept help from books, from mental health professionals, from spiritual advisors, whomever, because it's a tough road to hoe.
What about the issue of too much help? I mean, it works both ways. How do I know if I'm providing too much help to a surviving spouse of a colleague that died? And if I'm just the surviving spouse, how do I tell people, thanks, but no thanks?
Never promise something that you can't deliver. When somebody dies and you see the heartache that comes behind that as a human being, you want to reach out to that person and you want to do whatever you can to try to comfort them. And in so doing, sometimes people really promise things that they can't deliver, like I'll come over and cook dinner for you every Sunday night, or I will take Johnny to his baseball practice or Susie to her ballet classes every week for the rest of my life. When you've got kids at home who need you, and there's only so much time in the day, and that's very harmful to promise something that you can't deliver, because either you're going to hurt your own family, you're going to be resentful towards the surviving family, or you're simply going to fail to show up, and that will be damaging too. So it's a lot better to promise less and to ask people, what can I do? What do you need? And you'd be surprised at the kinds of things that people will tell you. Sometimes it's things that are just very practical and very small. And that makes a big difference. When somebody dies, people are cracked open. It's like we're covered with Velcro. Everything you do that's good or bad sticks at that time. So people remember the tiny things that you do, like picking up the mail, or showing up to mow the lawn once, or even offering to drive them to the doctors if that's what they need. So it doesn't have to be anything really grand. And the important thing is that you ask the person, is this helpful? Would you like me to do this? As opposed to swarming in and taking over. Remember, as I said before, these are people who feel like their whole life is suddenly out of control. All their plans, all their future, everything's different. Now, if you are the surviving spouse, to the degree to which you are able, you have to be direct with people. And you have to begin to figure out what it is that you need, how you can ask for it, and you have to begin to accept help. People who are married to first responders are similar to first responders themselves. Self-sufficient, capable, used to dealing with things on their own. Accepting help may not be an easy thing to do, particularly if the surviving person is a man. So it's important for you to be able to figure out what it is that you need and ask people for it. And if what you need is for them to stop calling you every day, then you need to tell them that. I appreciate your concern, but you don't have to call me every day. I'll call you, or call me once a month. And that kind of directness not only is helpful to the survivor, but it's also helpful to the people who are trying to figure out how they can help. Because first responders are first responders because they want to make a difference in people's lives. And so helping makes them feel better too. So sometimes they'll need some specific direction. But your basic and bottom line is never promise something that you can't deliver or won't be able to deliver without hurting your own life or feeling resentful.
Ellen, everything you've said so far is pretty much targeted at intact or happy families, but what about families where the person's died and left and the situation at home wasn't that happy? Or perhaps there were multiple families involved. There was a divorce in the background or something like that.
In a country in which 50% of almost all marriages, regardless of your occupation, end in divorce, we would have to expect that there will be these compound families and step families and complicated relationships. I think the important thing is to try to avoid conflict between the people involved, and to have respect for the fact that everybody will be grieving differently. And sometimes it will require, again, a neutral third party, a mental health professional, to come in and help the family. because these issues can get very complex and sometimes contentious, depending upon what the relationship was like in the family before the death. In a marriage that was either on the rocks or an unhappy marriage, and a person is killed in the line of duty, while we might presume that that would hurt less than the loss of someone that you were happily married to, I think some research would tell us that, in fact, that gets even more complicated, that there's more guilt, more responsibility, more internal conflict about things that were not resolved between the two married people, that were the hurtful things that were said, and there was no opportunity to make up for those. The fact that now that this person you were resentful for and felt like you didn't get enough from, now they're gone and you'll never get it. There's a whole lot of other kinds of grief that come up for families. I think it's just important for the department, for coworkers, for friends, for mental health professionals not to assume beforehand that everything was fine and happy in any specific family. It really requires some learning who this family is and what the state of the relationship was at the time of death. And of course, if somebody dies, even in a happy family, when somebody dies on the day you just had this stupid fight over something, that's going to really leave people with a great tarnish of guilt, and they're probably going to need some outside assistance to unravel those feelings, because all families fight. That's universal, and it wasn't that fight that killed the person, but sometimes the surviving people have a hard time separating that.
Ellen, thanks so much. I know this will be a big help to a lot of public safety professionals and their families.
You're very welcome. I appreciate being asked here. It's a very difficult and painful subject to talk about, and I always tell police families and firefighter families that I hope they take as good care of themselves as they do the rest of us.
Thanks.
You're welcome.